It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to be here, and it's a pleasure for the Goethe Institute, Max Müller-Barwan, to share this moment and this spirit. So, the question that has been asked to me was, why read translation? Let's make it short. Why read translations? Answer, because we cannot read all languages. Full stop. Simple question, simple and complete answer. And this, please believe me, is serious. It's not an ironic statement. It is like this. We all are born in Babylon. We all have to look at how we get the good things, and it would be an act of truly idiotic, self-hindering to renounce the huge cosmos of texts and books and works in foreign languages just because our knowledge of languages is naturally limited. That, I think, doesn't need to be explained further now. This is why so many wise people have always expressed their gratitude and appreciation for the often overlooked community of translators, a group of pioneers, virtuosos, and scouts of international cultural exchange who are rarely in the limelight and are much too often not valued highly enough. They help us to get out of the inescapable limitations of our access to world literature and into the wisdom and truth of texts from all parts of the world and from all generations, and to whom we all owe so much. Especially my house, the Goethe Institute. How much could I learn on my various international posts from translators who, through their often so scrupulous and sustainable work, make more valuable and competent contributions to the dialogue among cultures than whole legions of curators, organizers, and administrators like myself of the international cultural jet set. Now, there are always two standard statements that do fall when it comes to the special qualities of translation. The first is the metaphor of the boat, of the ferry, that transfers the text from one language shore to the other, which at the same time means the never avoidable transference losses, the basically always programmed failure of every translation, in the sense of an ideal one-to-one transfer from the original language to the other. This claim is stated as fundamentally to be abandoned, since it is guided by a false concept of language, which always has its own inherent qualities and is connected with the cultural worldview of the speaking collective, which is never the same as the other. Examples such as the large number of Inuit expressions for snow and the absence of such words in some language from the tropical regions are often cited. The second standard topos is that of the paradoxical success of translation in achieving a literary endeavor of its own, as a consequence of the problem just mentioned. What is then praised is the effect which, in view of the limits of the translator's job, namely to deliver a one-to-one translation, forces him or her to make his or her own literary effort, which in the end, at least occasionally, produces great works of translation in the sense of recreations or co-creations. Famous examples in my culture of this are the wonderful Shakespeare translations by August Wilhelm Schlegel in the late 18th century, which were extremely important and influential for the reception of the great Englishmen in Germany, and which are rightly as well regarded as independent masterpieces of German literature. The other way around, of course, this means that translations can also fail. God knows they can. As again, very famous examples show. For instance, the long-time standard translation into French of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, which in the 1950s every second French student carried in his pocket, until it became known that it was so bad that the entire French philosophy of these years, which was strongly influenced by Nietzsche, was based on a misunderstanding. Hence, the obviously unavoidable obligation that every generation must translate the great classics each new time. This is all very nice and right and has been told many times before, which is I want to take these thoughts one step further by remembering a beautiful moment I shared not long ago with Joe Lendle, Sunandini Banerjee, and Naveen Kishore, who were present there. It was at the Frankfurt Book Fair last October when the superb series of the Seagull Library of German Literature that has been mentioned also this morning was presented. Sitting on the podium next to Naveen and Joe and some of the important translators in this series was the filmmaker and author Alexander Kluge, himself represented with 4 books in this series. And he himself was using the metaphor of the boat, of the passage. He even spoke of an armada that takes the texts from not only from one continent to the next, but even more importantly, through the ages. The book boats as time machines. However, and this is what interests me now, he was not talking about translation in particular. In particular, he was talking about books in general. And thus, he gives us an important clue to our topic. If we take the above mentioned in regard to translation seriously, namely that the unconditional commitment to the source text, the fidelity to the original, stands always under the systematic reservation of possible failure, which means that the only chance of successful translation is the creative handling of this necessary aporia, then this actually expresses not only the problem of transition alone, but the fundamental dilemma of literature itself. And that means, taken seriously, every text, even the one in one's own mother tongue, is only understood within limits and will be received differently with each reading and by each reader. In this respect, every reader is a translator, which we understand immediately when we read old text. For example, when I, as a German, have to translate an old German text into my contemporary German. But even further, this applies not only to the act of reading, but also to that of writing. Is it not the case that even the production of the text in one's own language always leads to the limits of what the author is capable and of what the language is capable of at all? There is a famous dictum of Friedrich Schiller from 1797 which says in an approximate translation the following. It's important now that I stress the right word properly. Schiller says, if the soul is speaking, then, alas, the soul no longer speaks. Once again, if the soul is speaking, then, alas, the soul no longer speaks. What does that mean? It means that it is then no longer only the soul that expresses itself, that speaks, but actually what speaks is the language in itself. And that means you're never alone in your language. For example, on a very complicated path, actually all those who have already spoken in your language speak along with you. And there's no direct connection between the expression of what the soul wants to express and what the soul says. The wisest authors have always reported to us on this topic, and the great texts always bear witness to this, to the great dilemma of writing, to failure, to the challenge arising from the limitations and the calamity of language itself, but also, of course, to the great moments of success, which then, we all personally as readers know this moment, makes the miracle of literature happen when we read and feel and say, yes, precisely, that's it. And I believe that this can happen just as often and just as rarely in an original text as in a translation, which is why we must make the same demand of both author and translator, both must be masters of their language. Which, to come back to the claim or the supposition of this panel towards a borderless literature, makes things a little complicated, because just as much as literature, whether translation or not, can cross borders, it must necessarily remain within its limits, the limits of language. The paradox of literature is the paradox of language, to be both a border and a delimitation, freedom and isolation, a journey into the open and a dead end at the same time. But that, I admit, leads very far now. So thank you. I'm very much looking forward to the panel. Thank you.
Hello everyone, can you hear me? Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Bertolt, for that really interesting address that points to both the possibilities and the limitations of ideas, literatures traveling across borders through translation. This panel was originally to have been chaired by Jayapriya Vasudevan. I'm not Jayapriya, although we are about the same size in height and we kind of inhabit the same universe, but I hope I'll be able to fill her shoes. You know, in one way or another, since the morning, we have been talking about the subject that comes to rest in this panel, which is about how stories travel across borders, via languages, and through ideas, and in other ways. And I was very interested to see in your opening address, you and the manifesto that you presented, that although you did not specifically mention stories, but they lay at the heart of all the things that you were talking about, which the future is likely to hold in terms of literatures crossing borders. And although Naveen tried in his usual fashion to be quite equal in quickly redressing, having said content is king, and then said maybe I should have said queen, I wanted to actually come into that and say if content is king, translation is queen. And translation and stories are actually joined at the hip, and they travel across the world in very many different ways. But as Bertolt just pointed out, there are also, it's not an unproblematic thing, because the need to translate in particular ways changes also. And I was reminded of a story when you were speaking of the translation of Simone de Beauvoir's key text, The Second Sex, which survived for 60 years and was translated into English from French by a man, which in today's feminist world would be a complete no-no. And secondly, by a man who excised the bits and substantial bits that he thought did not need to be translated. And it wasn't until a few years ago that a full and complete translation of that text was available to us. And yet, even while we might question that, where would women and men in the world have been without that translation that was available to us, however imperfect, for 60 years? So it's a kind of double-edged sword. I have a stunning panel, and we have been talking by mail about what we should talk about, and we came up with many, many different discussions and ideas which are very serious. And then today we thought everybody has such wonderful stories to tell. And I think we're just going to tell our stories. So I'm going to start with the only woman on my panel, Vera Michalski. Vera, if you can tell us how, for you, you came to this telling of stories across the borders of language. You started to publish in the late 80s, early 80s, and with the idea of bringing Slavic texts to the world, but then it expanded into many other ways. So could you tell us a little about your journey?
Yeah, so when we started with Les Éditions Noir sur Blanc in 1987, the idea was openly to build bridges between East and West. So I'm saying East and West out of the European perspective, of course, meaning that this was still the time of the Iron Curtain, and we wanted ideas and stories to pass this border. and translated from Polish and Russian specifically into French. This was the beginning. And then a few years later, we started publishing as well lots of travel writing, among them, you know, William Dalrymple and many other authors. I'm thinking of William because we're in Jaipur, of course. And then later, with Bûcher-Chastel, we started publishing more and more foreign authors, quite a few Indian writers at the time, but of course translated as well from Spanish and many other, Norwegian, many other languages.
So say, for example, just to take an example, in Poland, because you published in Polish, in French, and
now in English, but it's a very small list.
Okay,
yes.
Now in English as well.
Yes.
And writers from across the world.
Yes.
So when you first began with Russian writers, what was the kind of reception in the world, in the languages in which you published?
We started mainly by exploring younger authors, and as well retranslated some older classical authors where the translations had aged, you know, because this is something with sort of very classical translations, they age. This is something we could address as well. And so once in a while you need to retranslate texts which otherwise are not anymore in adequacy with modern readership, you know. What was your question? Sorry.
My question was, what was the reception to...
Yeah, so the reception was, of course, in the beginning, since it was a very small niche publishing, a bit difficult, but after a while, you know, it became bigger as we had access to more important writers. Because as a young publisher, of course, you can only try to publish things that the bigger publishers have not grabbed before.
So, you know, talking about Russian writers, for example, with whom you began, they had quite a life in India, and our two speakers from here both have very interesting experiences of having read, translated, published writers from Russia. Devalji, can I ask you to tell your story? You've translated Dostoevsky into Rajasthani? Yes.
नमस्कार, आप मेरी मदद करेंगे कि मैं जो कहता हूँ उसे आप आगे तक पहुँचाएं।
आप थोड़ा रुक के बोलिए फिर ताकि संक्षेप में थोड़ा ट्रांसलेट कर सकें।
जी देखिए, ट्रांसलेशन की दुनिया यदि नहीं होती, अनुवाद की दुनिया नहीं होती, अनुवाद के सेतु नहीं होते, पुल नहीं होते, तो संभवतया फ्योदर दोस्तोवस्की मेरे घर नहीं आ सकते थे। मैंने बचपन में अपना साहित्यिक भूख को शांत करने के लिए जब किताबों की तरफ बढ़ा, तो सबसे पहले मुझे जो किताब हाथ में आई वो मैक्सिम गोर्की की मदर थी।
Okay.
जबकि
So Devalji is saying that translation has no borders. There are no bridges, or there are bridges. There are bridges. Translation is like a bridge that takes you from one place to another. And when he was a young boy, it was to assuage his hunger for learning for literature that he turned to Gorky's mother. Gorky's mother was one of the texts that...
तो इस तरह से जब मैं अपने सवेरे ब्रेकफास्ट की टेबल पर दोस्तोवस्की को अपने साथ पाता हूँ या सैमुअल बेकन को पाता हूँ, मेरे यहाँ मंटो बिना कोई पासपोर्ट लिए चले आते हैं, मेरे यहाँ इंतज़ार हुसैन साहब चले आते हैं। और जब इंतज़ार हुसैन साहब अपनी बात कहते हैं, वो जिस समय में अपना अफसाने लिख रहे हैं, ये वो समय है जो अपने उसके देश में बहुत मुश्किल कठिन समय है, और उस कठिन समय को वो एक लंबी काली रात के रूप में बखानते हैं। और वहाँ आरिफ लेला का जो अरेबियन नाइट्स का जो किस्सा है, एक शहरजाद और शहरयार नाम का बादशाह है जो हर रोज़ एक किसी स्त्री को लाता है अपने महल में, उससे कहता है मुझे कहानी कहो, और वो कहानी वो कहता है लेकिन शर्त यह है कि कहानी समाप्त नहीं होनी चाहिए। और वो कहानी कहते रहते हैं, और जो ही कहानी खत्म होती है वो उसका सर कटवा देता है। और उसी शहर में रहने वाली शहरजाद है जो पहली बार इस चुनौती को स्वीकार करती है और अपने पिता से कहकर करके कि मैं जाऊंगी वहाँ और वो जा कर के कहानी कहती है। और इतनी लंबी कहानी होती है कि सवेरा हो गया है और वो शहरयार कहता है कि आगे क्या हुआ। उसने कहा आगे तो दिन के वक्त में कहानी नहीं कहते, क्योंकि हमारे जो खास लोग होते हैं वो रास्ता भूल जाते हैं, इसलिए कल फिर रात को आने दीजिए, मैं फिर आपको कहानी सुनाऊंगी। और इस तरह से वो 1000 कहानियाँ सुना देती है और 1000 कहानियों के बाद शहरयार का मेटामॉर्फोसिस हो जाता है, कायाकल्प हो जाता है और वो उस दिन से सब कुछ को मारना छोड़ देता है। कहानी कभी खत्म नहीं होती। हम सभी लोग जो जन्म से बड़े हुए हैं, बिना कहानी के हम पैदा भी नहीं, अभी जवान नहीं हो सकते थे। तो इसलिए कहानी जो शहरजाद की जबान से निकला हुआ जो लिटरेचर है, वो लिटरेचर हर कहीं पर भी हवा की मानंद हर जगह जा सकता है। और वो जाने के से ही हमको इस लंबी रात के कटने की उम्मीद आएगी और हमारी मनुष्यता को यदि बचाए रखने का अगर कोई भी तरीका हो सकता है तो वो ऐसा ही है। क्योंकि मैं जब अनुवाद के माध्यम से दूसरी भाषाओं को जब पढ़ता हूँ या दूसरे लेखकों को पढ़ता हूँ तो मुझे बराबर ऐसा लगता है कि वहाँ पर भी लोग वैसे ही रोते हैं जैसे हमारे यहाँ रोते हैं, वैसे ही हंसते हैं जैसे हमारे यहाँ हंसते हैं। तो इसलिए न तो कहानी कभी खत्म होगी और साहित्य, बस अपनी छोटी सी बात कहूँ, हमारे यहाँ संस्कृत की एक सूक्ति है कि समुद्र कभी नदियों से नहीं अगाता और अग्नि जो है वो कभी काठ से नहीं अगाती, मतलब। और इसी तरह से साहित्य जो है वो भी एक ऐसा समुद्र है जिसमें सारी भाषाओं आकर करके मिल ले, फिर भी वो नहीं अगाएगा, वो अपनी सीमा को नहीं छोड़ेगा, सबको अपने भीतर समावेश कर लेगा। और यही मनुष्यता को बचाए रखने के लिए यही कारण है कि मेरे पड़ोसी देश के एक हमारे यहाँ के लोग, अभी एक यूनिवर्सिटी में एक बच्चे हम देखेंगे, फैज़ अहमद फैज़ साहब को गा रहे थे अपनी पीड़ा को कहने के लिए। मार्टिन लूथर किंग कहते हैं कि वी शैल ओवरकम वन डे, वो तो हम नहीं कहते, लेकिन हम कहते हैं हम होंगे कामयाब एक दिन। इस साहित्य की यही ताकत है जो अनुवाद के माध्यम से हम लोगों को ताकतवर बनाती है, मनुष्य बनाती है। थैंक यू।
I'm not sure how I can translate the beauty of what he said, and I didn't have the heart to stop him, but I'll try. Hindi walas in the audience, please don't give me 0 on 10 for doing this. So what Devalji talked about was that when at sitting down to breakfast in his home, he would have Gorky with him, and he would feed, it's a very boring word to say what he was saying, on Gorky as much as he would feed on the biscuits and the bread and the food that was there. And while he was doing that, unannounced, without passports, would arrive other writers at his table, such as Manto, such as Intezar Hussain, who are both writers from Pakistan. And when he read Intezar Hussein's work, Intezar Hussain was writing at a time in very dark times in Pakistan. And when he read that work, he was very moved by it, and he was reminded of the story of the Arabian Nights, in which Sherazad arrives to destroy the designs, and he gave a very long and detailed description, but because you're all familiar with that story, I shan't go into the details of it, but in which she told her father, she offered to go and said that I will tell the king the stories, and he will not cut off my head. And she told him story after endless story. And when the morning came and he asked her, and then what happened, she said to him, for that you have to wait for the night. And in that way, she avoided the certain death that many others had from not being able to finish the story or from getting their heads cut off. And he talks about how that wonderful feast of the telling of stories is what has really been inspirational to him. And he gave the metaphor of the ocean into which many rivers feed and which never actually fills up and becomes too full with the stories, but which absorbs them all into its heart. In the same way, literature is like a large ocean in which story after story after story in many languages goes in and occupies that space, and the heart of literature is big enough to absorb all those stories. And for him, that is what stories mean, that is what translation means, and that's what it has brought to him in his life. I hope I've translated reasonably accurately what you have said. Thank you so much. Thomas, could you tell us about your love of stories and literature?
Yeah, before I begin, let me thank Namita Gogleji and Sanjoy Kiroji and William Dalrymple for inviting me here to give this opportunity for me and to talk to you. Yeah, my story is something very similar to Chandra Prakash Devalji ka. See, in childhood, in a place like, like India being what it is with all languages, which are national languages, my language is Malayalam and his is Rajasthani. And we have had I think the good fortune to have these classical Russian works translated into our languages very early on. In our case, it is the early 1920s and 30s. And N.K. Damodaran, great translator, he translated the works. And these books, especially of Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Turgenev, Dostoevsky especially, these were the books that were my companions. I had a very kind of insecure, lonely childhood. I didn't have many friends. The friends were these books. And sitting in my remote village, reading in Malayalam, my language, these stories which took me far beyond our borders, to Russia of those times of the late 19th century, and imagining the whole lot, imagining the whole milieu, the kind of people, their conversations, the relationships, all that, that gave me a kind of real sense of freedom, traveling. You just close your eyes and you're there, that kind of a feeling. And from which experience, I had a similar, a little elder to me, an author. His name is Perumbadavam Sridharan. He wrote a novel on the life of Dostoevsky, the 30 days in the life of Dostoevsky when he was writing The Gambler, when he met his future wife, Anastasina, and fell in love with her, or rather, she encompassed him in her compassionate love. That will be the right word to use. So that wonderful novel, which sold hundreds of thousands of copies in Malayalam and came out in 300 editions, that story, which I have translated. The book is here in the shop. It's titled Like a Psalm, like a Psalm, Psalm. So that's the novel. So this man, Perumbadavam Sridharan, also had a similar experience like me, reading Dostoevsky's, all the works by Dostoevsky in his childhood, in his village, in Malayalam. And he wrote this novel entirely from his imagination. And when he had, he never visited St. Petersburg or Russia for that matter, when he wrote 25 years ago. But when he did visit about a couple of years ago, about 2 years ago, then he found the place, the entire place, though it is a new city, he found the city of his imaginations to be what it is, This is the kind of borderlessness that literature can play. That's a very interesting experience, when you talk about this, a very apt kind of theme that you brought up here, so I could share my part of the story like Devalji here. And yeah, this is for the time being what I have to say. And is there anything else that about my translation, my own efforts, I will come back. Will there be another round or? Yeah,
yes,
so
there will be another round. There will be another round, and I want to come back and talk to you a little bit about your publishing as well.
Yeah.
One of the things that Devalji said, which I actually forgot to mention, was that when he read translated works, it's also a realization came back to him that in other worlds, other cultures, people feel the same hunger, the same pain, they weep at the same things, and they laugh at the same things. That was a very poetic form of expression, and I forgot to mention that. Jules, your work is actually very different, and you are taking Buddhist literature from Tibet into different languages. How does that work, and what kind of reception do you find, and how does that travel across borders? You need a mic. Yeah.
Is it working?
Yeah, it works when you speak. It's just...
I see. I've been living and studying with Tibetan teachers since 1976.
Hold the mic a little bit closer. Yeah.
I've been living and studying with Tibetan teachers since 1976, and after a certain point I had learned the language well enough that I began serving as an oral translator for some of Tibet's most eminent teachers, which is what I've done for the past 35 years, along with translating books that I've studied with them. Their literary tradition and the oral traditions that are connected with it lie very much outside of any of the literary traditions that we might be familiar with and anything any of us might be talking about. They derive from the classical Indian civilizations that flourished between what you'd call the 1st century of the Christian era up till about the 12th, and this huge transmission of knowledge and literature from India to Tibet that took place over a period of about 450 years, ending roughly in the year 1200. And then they've been developing all of those stories and writing about them themselves since then until now. Their literary tradition operates entirely hand in hand with a vigorous oral tradition, because the way in which a book is given from one person to another is through a very personal exchange where the teacher reads the book aloud and explains it to the student. And there is literally no other way to enter into the literature, even though you're born into the culture. It's so complicated and technical and requires such a huge amount of context and personal explanation. Putting this into English is quite the task, not just because of the problems of language, which are enormous. The Tibetan language shares nothing with any Sanskrit or Latin or Chinese or any other language of those families. It's a language unto itself. And so learning it well enough and then being able to find ways to say those things in a European language, in my own case in English, is quite the challenge. But then making it possible for a reader to enter into an entirely different way of understanding birth and death, and the way in which stories themselves are told is quite the task. I think we're just barely at the beginning of figuring out how to do that. Up to this point, I think people who do the kind of work I do are just simply trying to get a hold on the technical details, and it's just recently, meaning in the past decade or so, that I think anybody is beginning to write something that a normal person might want to read, or might be able to read. You know, a highly literate person might be able to read. And it has much to do with the strange literary form, or the strangeness of the literary form, which tells stories in a very different way. They tell profoundly human stories when you finally are able to hear the story properly. But getting there takes a lot of work. So not quite sure what else to say about it at the moment.
So in a sense, what you're talking about is, as I see, two things. One is to bring a completely different form which combines the oral and the written, and both are intermeshed because they're part of a whole. It's not either this or that, into a world where the written word is valued, is the important thing. So you're making that cultural leap. But in doing so, you're also actually fighting for legitimacy for the form and the literature you're taking, because the literature itself is so foreign to the environment in which you're taking it. And yet you're saying that it does manage in some way to cross those borders. But how did you make a beginning to even enter that literature? What was it that took you there?
Oh, well, a series of coincidences. It's hard to know where to begin. Let's just say I had come to the point in my own life, though, as a young person. I had just finished college and I had become very interested in India's traditions generally, more or less out of nowhere, with no background of any sort that would have brought me here. And then gradually gravitated toward a more focused interest in India's Buddhist traditions, which had disappeared from India a long time ago and survived only in Tibet, where they had undergone quite a severe transformation. And I had decided that I would go to the University of Virginia, which was my home place, and earn a degree that would enable me to wander out to Colorado to study with a Tibetan teacher I'd come across. And the degree was going to allow me to teach high school English, and I thought that would get me a meal ticket. And so there I was at Virginia, and I had, by sheer accident, walked into the most deeply resourced program in Buddhist studies that was then to be found anywhere in North America. And I just managed to spend as long as I possibly could there before coming to India in the 80s to live with Tibetan teachers here and gradually learn the language deeply and well and be brought into their literature in the way that I had wanted to. So it's a bunch of historical accidents that just comes out of the Tibetan diaspora and the paranoia of the CIA. That's more or less the roots of it.
Okay, so many borders were actually crossed there. Let me come to you. As a publisher, what has been your experience with, do you translate a lot into German, or is it translating German texts out of German into other languages, and what's your experience of that?
Well, Germany is a curious country, which sounds lovely. It means, first of all, we travel a lot, which is not good for our carbon footprint, and what means we translate a lot into German, which is good for the translators and good for the authors of abroad who are seen, and very good for the German readers because they got an idea that might be bigger than their own, what they see in their everyday lives. And it is very interesting, for example, when we hear about Donald Trump saying, oh, the Germans, they sell us everything and they don't buy our things and we should punish them, then I, as a publisher, tend to say, well, there's something missing. You don't buy our books. But
he probably doesn't read books.
Yeah, but we buy everything that is written in English and translated. So we do this a lot. And I'm a publisher, I'm a writer, I'm a translator, I'm an editor since over 20 years. And the longer I do this, first of all, I try to understand the differences between these tasks, but I also sometimes think maybe it's all the same, more or less. They are more connected than we think. And sometimes these specific tasks are not always what they are, and I would like to point out two things in there. For example, when we talk about translations, we talk about two things: how they cross borders, how how they are a fairy, as Bertolt said, how they bridge things. But maybe they do also other things. And the second thing is we always say, oh, so many things get lost in translation. That's the usual thing we say about translations. And I want to say, well, maybe that is not that big a problem, but let me first come to the other thing. For me as a writer, translating, first of all, wasn't about crossing bridges. It was about learning to write. I spent most of my college years or something translating, never thinking about publishing it. It was just that I translated it, and I learned not only the other languages, but my own languages in trying to bring ideas from elsewhere into my voice. And later on, when I studied literature and literary writing, we spent hours and hours sitting together trying to learn literary translation. For example, we had a course over 2 years we read, because there was one text that was translated so many times that it was easy to compare different versions. That was the Bible. We didn't care that much for the Bible, but we cared about, because we know in the Bible everything has meaning. So we sat for years, everybody had one translation on his knees, and we compared one sentence and the next sentence, thinking about what is the difference. And that is the best lesson in understanding style and meaning and words and syntax and so on. So translation is not only about crossing borders, it is also about understanding the idea of a language. And nobody knows a text better than the translator. Not the publisher, not the editor, not even the author himself. Often it's the translator who says, well, what does that mean? And the author says, oh, I never thought about that. Second point, our constant fear that, oh, so many things could be lost in translation. Yes, that is right. And my answer until today was always that every reader is a translator, so we should be okay with the fact that something is lost in this process. And I like very much what Bertolt said in his keynote, that already the writer is a translator. He translates his own ideas into words, and already there a lot of things get lost, and we all know that. Everybody who ever tried to write a whole own single sentence knows how much is lost on this bridge. And yes, that is sad, but no, that is not sad, because if this ambiguity wouldn't be in the words and in literature, and this possibility that things get misunderstood, the whole literature would collapse. Literature is about ambiguity and the possibility to misunderstand it. If literature would be clear, it wouldn't be literature. It wouldn't be there. So we should embrace the idea that translation has its faults. That's the point.
Yeah.
And just to stress this, because you asked to my experience as a publisher. For example, Hanse Publishing House is very famous in Germany because we do new translations of old books. And that is something that is so important. As we heard in the beginning, translations need to be redone, and redone not only because they might have been bad, but also because time changes. The originals doesn't get old, the translations get old, and so we care a lot about these new translations of classics.
Yeah, thank you. I know, Vera, you want to say something, please. Yes.
Yes, I wanted to say that being a publisher that work in different languages, I've always found the question of how a book travels, how a book functions in different territories, very interesting. And sometimes, you know, I discuss with my Polish colleagues and I say, this book seems really fascinating for Poland. And they tell me, we are not so sure, but if you insist, we will do it, you know. So this is very much about intuition sometimes, and we've had some really good surprises with books that seemed really far away from Polish, you know, sensitivity, and worked out. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I had a recent example last year when Olga Tokarczuk won the Nobel Prize for Literature, that she was already a very widely translated author, and her latest book, which is a magnificent novel called The Books of Jacob, which I believe is just about coming out in English, not quite yet, but has been published in German and in many other countries, and in Swedish, of course, which helped for the Nobel Prize. The translators of Olga's books have started a sort of network to communicate about the difficulties in translation. For example, she uses in the Books of Jacob, there are 20 different kinds of Yiddish. You know, I didn't know that there were 20 kinds of Yiddish, and so they managed to exchange with the Israeli translator and finally managed to, you know, to solve that really difficult problem. So the quality of translations, I think worldwide, is increasing tremendously, because in old times, I mean, when I'm talking about old times, it's about 30 years ago, publishers were not aware of how important translators are. They were underpaid, they were not given enough time to finish and to polish and everybody knows the translation has to rest before you edit it and before you publish it. And so people were used to read really faulty translations. And now publishers are aware of that, and the quality has really improved, and translators are really acknowledged for what they are, meaning, authors in a way. They are the authors of the translation, and they know the books much better, like Joe said.
Thank you. Jules, I saw you nodding in sympathy when Yo was talking. But thank you for actually turning our attention to other aspects of translation, not only the outward movement of literatures, but also the self-reflexivity of it, and also translation as interaction with different cultures, with different people. And in India, of course, because we have so many different languages, there is also the aspect of translations traveling within our languages. Thomas, I want to come back to you. We have about 5 minutes before we open it up for questions, and I'd like you both to come in. If you could talk a little more about Kerala's tradition of publishing translations from especially Russian and other languages, and how you grew up. I mean, you've talked a little about those, and your own experience as a translator. And Devalji, if after him, you can also talk about how, when you translated, Apne Crime and Punishment translate, you know, you translated Crime and Punishment, how did you actually feel when you were entering that culture?
Yeah, in Malayalam, publishing of translations, it began early in the century, or in the 20th century, and the there was a cooperative society of writers, SPCs, Publishers Association. They spearheaded the translation publication, the movement of publication of translations. And now DC, Ravi, he was sitting down here. DC Books, they publish an entire, whatever is appearing in the West, winning the Nobel Prize or the Booker Prize, there will be a translation of the book the next 3 months, for 6 months, as soon as the translation is finished. So that kind of reception of translator works among the Indian languages that I know, I come to that, how I know about Indian languages. I think Malayalam, I don't want to sound chauvinistic, but Malayalam receives much more than many other languages in India. And speaking of which, we have 24 languages, national languages that the Sahitya Academy, where I work for the last nearly quarter of a century now, the Sahitya Academy, the main activity is this, publishing translations. How? Because the Sahitya Academy award winner, this is the biggest award in the country, 24 languages, 24 lakhs of rupees, 1 lakh for each language. And the winner in each language, the prize, the award-winning book in each language is translated into 23 other languages. And those are published. And about 600 odd books are published every year. So that is how India, a country like India, in which there are so many different full-grown literatures, are taken care of through translation, only through translation. And I am the editor of Indian Literature, the bi-monthly English journal. We manage, to be there in publication because of the translation. It's all about translation. Publishing, mostly, it is translation of material from all the other 23 languages except English is also a national language of India. And what's most interesting is we also have Hindi. Hindi is Samkalin Bharatiya Sahitya, is also translation in Hindi of all national language literatures, poetry, fiction, prose, and literary criticism, all those genres. And this is quite interesting because this is, I think, a unique kind of experience for any country. So this is how we are holding ourselves together. We claim of having one Indian literature. It is through translation that we hold our our identity as unity in diversity kind of thing, which is under threat, as some of people were saying. But this is the sure way of surviving as a nation with a voiced country. It's a country of many voices holding together through translation. This is a great story of translation that we can claim that we are doing now.
Thank you. Devalji, एक ही minute. I think I thought we had 12 minutes, but we have only 2. Is that right? That's right. I can see 11:23 here. But what time? How much time do we have? We have about 2 minutes. Okay. Devalji, 1 minute. आधा मिनट फिर मुझे ट्रांसलेट करने के लिए. ठीक.
मैं ये कह रहा था कि मेरे जर्मन दोस्त एक बात की शिकायत कर रहे थे कि अनुवाद की प्रक्रिया में कई चीज़ें छूट जाती हैं. बिल्कुल ठीक है, हम लोग जानते हैं, लेकिन जो कुछ भी हम तक पहुंचता है बलिहारी उसकी है. और हाइनरिक ब्योल की एक कहानी है, द क्लाउन, मस्खरा, एक जर्मन के लेखक. अब मैं जानता हूं कि उसमें से कई एक जो भाषा की इंट्रिकेसीज हैं वो सब छूट गई होंगी, लेकिन जो कुल मिलाकर के जो चरित्र है, जो हमेशा हंसाने का काम करता है, और वो कभी भी जिंदगी में घर पे आता है तो कभी नहीं हंसता, क्योंकि वो उसके मांसपेशियां हंसने में इतनी थक जाता है वो कि फिर वो घर में अपनी पत्नी और बच्चों के साथ नहीं हंसता. यह जो चीज़ मुझ तक पहुंच रही है, यह जो पीड़ा मुझ तक पहुंच रही है, ये मुझे विश्व मानवता के एक कुटुंब की तरह से बनाता है. ये अभी ग्लोबलाइजेशन और ये सब हम 90 दशक में कह रहे हैं, मेरे यहाँ साहित्य में तो ये सैकड़ों सालों से हो रहा है. ये हम लोग ही हैं जो लेखक या अनुवादक हैं, वो कम से कम विश्व नागरिक हैं. हमारे यहाँ पर कोई और दूसरे CAA और ये सब लगाने की ज़रूरत नहीं होती. साहित्य में हम अपने आप उनको ये मान्यता दे देते हैं. धन्यवाद.
So Devalji is referring to what Yo said about what is lost in translation, and he said while admitting whatever is lost in translation, whatever you do gain after that loss is sufficient unto itself and is very meaningful. He gives an example of a story of Heinrich Böll in which the man, the protagonist, comes home and is so exhausted that he's never able to smile or laugh with his wife and children. And he says, just I don't care what was lost in the telling of that story in translation, but the pain that that man must have felt at not being able to express happiness and laughter was sufficient for him to understand what that man must have gone through, and just to have that was extremely precious and brought a whole sea of humanity home to him and brought to him the idea of the world citizen, which the Citizenship Amendment Act, which is at the current moment threatening to destroy our country, nothing like that is needed. And because you mentioned the CAA, in closing, I would just like to tell you a little story which has nothing to do with literature, but has everything to do with translation. And this was that 2 days ago I was in Kerala, in Kochi, and going past a very crowded area in search of food, I came across a small demonstration, or not quite a demonstration, but by the side of the road, a stage, and lots of people sitting, and there was a protest on the Citizenship Amendment Act. And first a group of young women was singing songs and shouting slogans, and after that 3 young men in very fancy hairstyles and very tight trousers and t-shirts went up on stage, and they said they were going to perform protest songs in rap, in Malayalam and Urdu, and they called it halal rap. And they did the most stunning performance, and I thought, this is what doesn't need language. It's pretty amazing. So thank you all. I'm so sorry we don't have time for questions, but there's lots of thoughts here perhaps you can take away, and thank you all for listening.